This is a 1993 Bugatti EB110, and it's the Bugatti that no one knows about. Everybody knows the Veyron and the Chiron, but this was Bugatti's supercar in the 1990s. It has a turbo V12, and less than 150 of these were built for the entire planet. And today, I'm going to review this one. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website with cool cars from the modern era. Throughout the entire month of June, Cars and Bids is celebrating its 1-year anniversary, our first birthday, with free listings. Right now, through the end of the month, if you type in the discount code BIRTHDAY when listing your car, you can get a free listing to sell your car and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some great sales recently, including this beautiful C7 Corvette ZR1, which sold for $158,000, this Audi RS4 convertible, which sold for just over $29,000, and this fantastic Volkswagen Passat W8 manual transmission wagon, which sold for $22,000. If you're looking to buy a cool car from the modern era, Cars and Bids has great selection and daily auctions, and if you're looking to sell your cool modern enthusiast car this month, get a free listing using the discount code BIRTHDAY to celebrate Cars and Bids' 1-year anniversary. So let's talk EB110. You probably know Bugatti as a brand under the Volkswagen umbrella, but that wasn't always the case. Bugatti was originally founded as a French company. It built some of the world's most extravagant cars, and it went bust in the 1950s. In the 1980s, the Bugatti brand was purchased by an Italian entrepreneur who decided to revive Bugatti in Italy. So he built a big factory in Italy and created a supercar, the EB110. That doesn't sound as crazy as you think, because the 90s were full of startup attempts at making a supercar. You had Vector with first the W8 and then later the M12. Jaguar tried it out with the XJ220. Acura gave it a shot with the NSX. You had the weird Cizeta Marauder thing. And probably the best known 90s first try at a supercar was the McLaren F1, now world famous. So reviving Bugatti with a new supercar made sense, and this car was perfect for the job. It had a V12, only 3.5 liters, but quad turbocharged, which was insane back then and still is. This car had over 550 horsepower, which was a huge figure for the time, and it had all-wheel drive, which was incredibly rare on supercars back then. It also had the famous Bugatti brand name, well known for building some of the most amazing cars on the planet only decades earlier. Unfortunately, it all came to a crashing halt in the mid-90s. Not enough people bought the EB110, and the Italian version of Bugatti went bust after making less than 150 EB110s for the entire world. And of course, you know the rest of the story. In the late 90s, Volkswagen acquired the Bugatti brand name and set out trying to make the fastest car on the planet, which they did. But for a while in the 90s, Bugatti was Italian, and they made this, the EB110, and today I'm going to review it. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of this car and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. There are many. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the EB110 with simply climbing inside, which is already an unusual process. You walk up to the car and you might think this is the door handle. There's a little slot where you can put your fingers in and open up the door, but there's no handle there. Instead, the door handle is located down here under this crease on the outside of the door. You have to reach down and pull on this little latch, and that unlatches the door, and then you can put your hand into this little finger slot on the side of the door and open it up. And once you've done that, the door of course opens upwards, scissor doors, like you would expect for a serious exotic car, which this is, and then you are welcomed into the EB110. Now, the first thing you see with the door open is, of course, the door sill, where you have Bugatti printed in very large letters, the old school Bugatti font, letting you know you're not climbing into just any supercar. This is a very special one. Now, also in this door sill area, you have a few other items. One is this little latch next to the seat. You can see it has the Bugatti logo on the bottom. You pull that and it releases the cover over the engine compartment. We will get to that in a minute. First, I want to talk about these buttons down here. You can see in the door sill area next to the driver's seat. Now, when you close the door, these buttons aren't covered by the door. They're still available to the driver, and they have some interesting functions. Probably the most unusual button down here is got a picture of a car with a door on it with arrows pointing up or down. So maybe thinking, do those buttons raise or lower the doors automatically? And the answer is no, actually, they don't do that, but they do unlatch the door. If you're sitting in the car and you want to get out, you press this little door up button, and it's like a window switch, but for the door unlatches, and then you can push it open the rest of the way. Interestingly, on the driver's side of the EB110, you have that switch for both sides. So you can unlatch the passenger side door if you want to, in case your passenger just can't figure it out and you want them to get out of the car, you can unlatch their door and they can climb out. And I suspect this happens quite often, opening the passenger side door, because the little diagrams showing which door these buttons open show images of the car corresponding to the side door they open, but it's a little difficult to tell unless you look closely exactly which door you can open. But basically, those are your door openers in the EB110. They look like power window switches, but actually they open up the doors. Now, it's worth noting this is an electronic release, so if the battery fails, it won't work to open up the doors. You're probably wondering, what would happen then? Are you trapped in your EB110? No, you are not. There is a second emergency door handle here on the door panel. You can pull this open, and that will mechanically or manually open the doors, and then you can climb out. So even if these buttons fail or if the battery's dead, you can still get out of your EB110, thankfully. Now, one interesting thing with this door button, obviously if you push up, that unlatches the door, and then you can push the door up and get out, but there's also a down button, which I'm not really sure what it does. If you press it, you can hear the door makes a little sound like it's latching or unlatching, but it doesn't seem to have an effect. You'd think maybe if you get the door close to latching and you press that button, it would completely latch it, but it doesn't seem to do that. I'm not really sure what exactly it does. Now, you might think that would be the door locks, but in fact, that is controlled with this button at the top marked block. The power locks of this car are controlled with the block button. You press up to unlock the doors. You press down to lock the doors using the block button. Not sure why they chose the word block for the door locks, but that's what it does. You want to lock the doors, you press block. Now, it's also worth noting in this vicinity, you also have two other controls. These are seat controls, of course. The upper one moves the backrest forward or backwards, the driver's seat, and the other one is for lumbar support. If you want to move the seat forward or backwards, the whole seat, there's actually a little latch on the bottom. You pull that and then kind of throw your weight like most car seats, and that will move the seat forward or backwards, but these little controls power operate the backrest and the lumbar support. And it's worth noting you have this same switch panel over on the passenger side with all of the same controls, except the passenger side switch panel only has a door opener button for the passenger door. The driver side has both passenger and driver door, but the passenger side only has the passenger door button. All the other buttons are the same, including the famous block button to lock or unlock the doors. But anyway, next we move further inside the EB110. I want to start with the steering wheel. You can see it's a fairly simple Nardi steering wheel. It has Nardi imprinted in the leather at the bottom, and of course the Bugatti logo imprinted in the leather right in the middle. And it looks very simple, fairly sports car-like, not necessarily crazy supercar-like, but it is a cool looking steering wheel. Now, in the center, you have the horn pad, and of course you press the horn and it is insane. Like a lot of Italian-built supercars from this era, take a listen to the EB110 horn. Next, also in this vicinity, we move on to the gauge cluster, and if you've watched a lot of my videos, these gauges might look familiar. That's because they were also used in Lamborghini models of the time. I believe the Diablo used these gauges, so they probably shared the same supplier, which was fairly common for Italian supercars back in the day. The same is also true of the stalks coming off the steering column. The turn signal stalk and the wiper stalk were also used in Lamborghini models and probably some other Italian cars of the era. Again, not all that surprising, and not surprising to see those in this car. And by the way, speaking speaking of the gauges, one quirky little item to note, when you turn the key to accessories, obviously all the warning lights turn on like they do in every car, but one warning light I love in here is this one with the steering wheel with a little drop of liquid on it. Obviously this is to let you know that like your steering fluid is low or something like that, but what a great way to show it, just a little steering wheel and liquid. It totally makes sense and gets the point across. I like it, it's kind of charming. But anyway, back to the subject of shared parts. Next we move into the center control stack and the climate controls. These are very familiar looking. They were shared with a lot of cars from this era, both exotic cars and regular everyday cars. Very simple climate controls that again shared the same supplier, and they were used in a lot of different vehicles. And again, not that surprising to see it in this car, since Bugatti, the upstart Italian brand, wasn't going to create their entirely separate new climate controls just for this car. It was easier to use controls from a supplier. Now, interestingly, the climate vents in this car are kind of unusual. You can see on the vents themselves, there are two switches. The switch on the side controls the air going up or down, of course, since the slider goes up or down. The switch actually mounted on the vent moves the air left or right. But the weird thing here is you can see the vent on the left, the little slider can only move the air over to the right, and then if you move it to the left, it sort of stops in the middle. The vent on the right can move the air to the left, but if you move it to the right, it stops in the middle. So really, if you're driving this car and you want air blowing on you, you're going to be using the vent on the right to move air to the left, because the left vent doesn't actually do that. Kind of an interesting quirk of the EB110. Now, next up, also in this vicinity, next to the climate controls, you have the window switches. You can see these little individual square buttons are the window switches, same type of buttons they use for those little controls on the door sill, but the ones mounted here control the windows. Now you have obviously driver's side window and passenger side window, and when you put the windows down, they are tiny. A very small portion of the actual windows in this car rolls down. It's only this little piece under this black trim on the window. The reason for that is because of the design of the car. You can see the door curves on the side, and so the entire window couldn't go down and like curve with the door, so they've cut out as much as they possibly can to get the window to roll down as much as possible. But in the EB110, that's all the window rolling down that you get. This was also common in sports cars in the 90s. The McLaren F1 was also like this, the Subaru SVX very famously, but it's always interesting to see a window within a window, and only the smaller bit actually rolls down. Next up, another interesting item in this vicinity is this switch here, which turns on a cooling fan. So when you're driving the car around, especially in stop and go traffic, you don't want to get too hot, you turn on the cooling fan with this switch. I don't think this switch was factory installed, but it may have been, or it may have been installed by an owner later who wanted to increase reliability. Driving the car around, you could manually turn on the fan to make sure it wouldn't overheat in traffic, which makes sense. Now, also in this vicinity, you have two gauges in the center here. You can see over on the left, you have the fuel gauge, which has the Bugatti logo inside of it. And over on the right, you have a clock. And there's this little blue dial in between the two. And of course, that would be the adjuster for the clock if you want to change the time in your EB110. Now, next up, speaking of the fuel gauge in this car, let's talk about how to open the fuel door. It's kind of an interesting process. You could look all around this car trying to find the release for the fuel door, and you wouldn't really find it unless you looked on the ceiling. It's right here, this little gas pump dripping. You pull that, and that opens the fuel door. Now, it's on this little panel of other release switches that also have other functions. To the left of the fuel door, you have the parking lights, and then two sets of fog lights front and rear. To the right of the fuel door, you have the ABS switch, except that's not actually a switch. Don't pull that. That's just a warning light. So you have four switches in here and then one warning light that looks like a switch, but at least there's no blanks. Now, next up, also on the ceiling in this car, you can see here you have a lighting assembly in here, interior lights. The light over on the left is pretty simple. You just press this button, it turns on sort of a general interior light like you might want if you're getting in or out of the car. The other light, though, is more interesting. You press this little button and it would turn on this thing. It's not working right now. The bulb is probably burned out, but you move this around and you could shine a map light on wherever you wanted it. So if the passenger is sitting here and wants their map illuminated, they could actually move this little movable light to show what they're looking for. Same deal over on the driver's side. That is a pretty cool idea. Instead of having individual map lights, driver and passenger, just have one that can be focused exactly where you want it, like a spotlight. And next up we move on to the seats in this car, which are kind of interesting. They're fairly grippy looking sport seats, as you can see, especially the bottom part is intended to keep you in place. A lot more than most sports cars from this era, the sport bucket seats hadn't really become common at this time. One interesting thing about these seats though, you can see the Bugatti logo is on the side of the seats. On the side of the headrest, you have the Bugatti logo stitched in there, looks nice. On the actual middle of the seats, where you'd normally find the manufacturer logo, you have the seat company's logo there, which is definitely an odd decision. Never really seen that before. It's almost like the seating or upholstery supplier kind of takes precedence over the manufacturer. It's weird to see that logo there instead of the Bugatti one. Now, if you move into the center console, you can also see storage panels in here. The one in the front is the cigarette lighter and ashtray, of course, and the one in the back is just a center storage panel where you could store stuff, although not much stuff because it's not very deep, but at least you have some storage in this car. Also, speaking of storage, another item in here is the glove box lid. That's over on the passenger side, of course. You turn this little switch and you can open up the glove box, and again, a little bit more storage, which is important, as I will demonstrate later when I show you the rest of this car's storage capabilities. But anyway, there's your glove box, and you can of course put stuff in there like most other cars. And one other interesting interior item would be the rear view mirror. You look at it, it looks like a fairly standard rear view mirror, although below it you can see 3 settings: off, low, and high. I assume this is for rear view mirror dimming. You can turn it completely off, or you can have like a low dimming setting or a higher setting, which is pretty good for supercars because you're so low that lights are always getting in your mirrors and blinding you, so you might want to turn up your dimmer, which you can in the EB110. But anyway, next up we're going to move under the hood, and so we pull that little latch next to the driver's seat like I showed you before, and that pops open the engine cover. So next up, let's talk engine, although let's start with the engine cover. Now once you've unlatched it, you can see it's in this position about 1 inch off the car, and then you can just lift it up. There's no additional release or anything like that. You just pop open the engine cover, and it stays open in kind of a strange way. You push it all the way to the top, sort of the max that it can go, and then it kind of locks in place, and you just leave it, and then it reveals the engine. This car has a pretty special engine. First thing just to look at, it's beautiful and surprisingly large considering it's only 3.5 liters. You can see V12 and Bugatti is printed right on the engine in the metal. It looks fantastic, gorgeous. This is a view that not too many people get to see. Now the cool thing about this car is it is quad turbocharged. That is not common now. There are very few cars that have more than 2 turbochargers, although newer Bugattis do as well. But it was especially a crazy thing back in the early 90s. A quad turbocharged supercar seemed totally, absolutely ridiculously insane, and indeed it was. Like I said, this car made over 550 horsepower back then, which was a huge figure, and it just had a much larger engine than a lot of the rivals at the time, like for instance the Jaguar XJ220 with its mere 6-cylinder. The EB110 had a smaller number in its name, but a much bigger engine. And of course you want to close the engine compartment. It's just the opposite procedure from opening it. You just kind of push it up a little bit, which unlocks it, and then you can just put it down and close it, and then you've closed the hood in a Bugatti EB110. And next up, a few other interesting things on the outside of the EB110. I want to start with the fuel door, which is over here on the passenger side. Now, I already showed you that you pull that little release in the ceiling inside the car, and that pops open the fuel door on the passenger side, as you can see, but there is a second fuel door over on the driver's side. That fuel door is a mirror image of the one over here on the passenger side, but when you pull that release in the car, only the passenger side fuel door opens. So how do you open the other flap, whatever that is? Well, you have to go into the engine bay. There's a little loop back there. You can see like a little string at the very corner of the engine bay. You pull on that and open up the second fuel door in this car. And indeed, it is a second fuel door in this car. You pop open this flap, you can see a little cap inside. You unscrew to add fuel, just like over on the passenger side. You have 2 separate fuel doors and fuel filling areas in this car. Now, I'm not sure if this car has 2 fuel tanks, but I will say that when you start the car, temporarily all the warning lights light up. You can see 2 different low fuel warning lights, one on the left and one on the right. So my guess is there are 2 separate tanks, and it will let you know if your left tank is low or if your right tank is low with 2 separate low fuel warning lights. That is a pretty crazy thing. It's also crazy that one fuel door is so accessible and easy to open with the little switch inside, and the other one you have to dig all the way into the back of the engine compartment to get it open in order to fill your second fuel tank. I also love when you close the fuel filler flaps in this car, you can see mounted on top of them you have like a NACA duct to direct air into the back of the car. So it's not just a fuel filler flap, it also is like an air channel to get air into the engine. One other thing I like in this area, you can see right above the fuel flap you have EB110, this car's like logo. Although if you looked at it like this, you would think this car was called the 110 EB. I'm not sure why they styled it that way, but that was like the logo for the EB110, and this is the only place on the outside of the car where it actually says EB110. You have it on the passenger side, and you have the same thing over on the driver's side in the same place. That's how you know you're looking at the EB110. And next up, another cool thing on the outside of this car is the wheels. I have always loved this wheel design. This was the original wheel in the EB110. Now the EB110 is maybe better known for these later wheels that came out in a later model, but I always liked these. They were so distinctive and characteristic for this car. They are also center lock wheels made by BBS. Center lock wheels were not common at the time that this car came out in exotic cars. They were pretty common on race cars, but most road cars did not have them. Obviously, they've become more common in the years since, but this is a very early adoption of a center lock wheel. Very unusual item. The EB110 had it. And next up, we move up to the front of the EB110, and you can see my very favorite design element on this entire car, and that would be the grille. You can see this little grille curved on the top, flat on the bottom. This was an old school Bugatti thing. Bugatti models in the 1920s, 1930s had this grille design, and so Bugatti revived in the 1990s, and Italy wanted to keep that little piece of heritage. Obviously, it doesn't really work with the front end of this car, so they made it really tiny, and it still has the distinctive characteristic Bugatti grille. Now, when Volkswagen revived Bugatti again in the 2000s with the Veyron, they put this grille front and center in the Veyron, again much larger, but you can see it here very small, a little nod to Bugatti's heritage. Obviously, they could have just made these lines go across the front of the car and not do this, but they did it as a little reminder of Bugatti's heritage, and I think that is a very, very cool design element on this car, if you notice it. It's a very small touch. Now, one other thing you notice up here is this flat front end, tremendously flat. In fact, going up to the windshield, it's all just sort of one flat piece going down to the front of the car, very much a wedge shape up here. And that is also true of the headlights, very flat and angled up here, almost like a triangle. And it's kind of strange. The turn signals are in the corner in this little side area, very small, little Bugatti turn signals. The headlight housing, of course, just has the headlights and the brights, the high beams, and that's this little piece in the center in the actual housing itself. And those are the headlights in a Bugatti EB110. Kind of interesting. You don't often see how those function. You also notice up here you have one windshield wiper, only one windshield wiper on this car. Unless you look closely, because actually there are 3 windshield wipers in this car. If you look really closely, you can see 1, 2, 3 individual wiper blades all on the same wiper arm. So it looks like this car has a single wiper, like a lot of sports cars did at the time, but actually it has 3 separate wipers, all angled sort of different directions in order to wipe off as much window as possible when it rains, so you could continue your performance driving. That is a very cool and interesting quirk. Now, as for this front end, it does in fact open. There's a little latch on the driver's footwell, like for a lot of cars. You pull it, and then this pops open, but you can see when it's open, there's no storage in here. You have the battery here, a few other mechanical components, but no storage at all. This is important because I already showed you the rear of the car, and there's no storage back there either. In the engine compartment, some cars have like a half engine, half cargo area. Not this. No storage in front, no storage in back. And that's why the glove box I showed you earlier is important. That's the largest storage space you have in the EB110. You better not try to go anywhere with luggage in one of these, because it won't fit unless you don't have a passenger. Now, it may surprise you to learn that this car doesn't have storage back here, because behind the engine compartment there is this panel, and you would think that is a trunk or a cargo area, but in fact it is the wing. You might be wondering, why doesn't this car have a wing? Some EB110s you see pictured have a wing up, but this car, it's been down the whole time. There's no button inside that I showed you to put a wing up, so what do? The answer is the wing goes up when you turn the car on. So you turn the car on and automatically the wing goes up. You turn the car off, like it is now obviously, the wing goes down. So every time you see an EB110 pictured with the wing up, that means it's on. And every time you see one pictured with the wing down, that means it's off. or broken. But in this car, it works just fine, and it goes up every time you turn it on. One other thing I like back here is the taillights. You can see these ovals on the back, and they're particularly special. You have turn signals in one corner, brake lights in another area, reverse lights in another area, and there are lines going through, horizontal lines going through the center of these ovals, I guess to make the rear light housing just look a little bit more exciting and unusual and special. But that's the rear lighting EB110, not particularly exciting or thrilling compared to modern lighting standards. You also have like holes back here, individual rectangles, several of them on the sides of the license plate and above it. Obviously those are for grill, for airflow to cool the car down. It's just interesting to see that it didn't just have one big grill piece. Instead they went with several different rectangles on the outside, kind of a strange design choice. And finally, let's talk about Bugatti, the brand. Most people know Bugatti as a French company, and indeed it is a French company, and it was founded as a French company, and it created some of the most extravagant, beautiful cars in the world in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s as a French company. But in the 1950s, the original Bugatti went bust, and it was purchased by an Italian entrepreneur in the 1980s to create a new Bugatti supercar with the Bugatti brand, except in Italy. He built a factory in the Italian town of Campo Galliano, and that factory is still standing today with Bugatti logos all on the outside, covered in vines and growth because it's been abandoned for decades. Basically what happened is the EB110 built in the factory came out, went on sale, and it did sort of okay. Michael Schumacher bought one, which was a big deal for the car, and they even came out with a later super sport version that had more power, but not enough people bought this car to keep the company afloat, and eventually it just went bust. Now, one interesting thing about Bugatti, when the company ended, there were a lot of spare parts and spare cars and spare engines sitting around, and most of them were purchased by a German company called DeMuro, who continued to make EB110s as the DeMuro EB110. They made a few more units after Bugatti production stopped. So there are Bugatti EB110s, and then there are DeMuro EB110s that came a little bit later, which is kind of an interesting fact about this car. But anyway, less than 150 Bugatti EB110s ended up being made before the company went bust, a short-lived experiment to revive Bugatti in Italy before Volkswagen bought the brand and revived it with their roots in France. The EB110, quite a special car, and indeed the Bugatti that most people aren't aware of. And so those are the quirks and features of the Bugatti EB110. Now it's time to get it out on the road and drive it. I am very nervous. Let's do it. All right, driving the EB110. This is a truly amazing experience. I've wanted to do this pretty much since I started filming these videos like 8 years ago. Done the XJ220, done the McLaren F1. This is has been for me a complete holy grail car that I've barely even seen, let alone been around and driven. So first thing you notice when you get inside here, the pedal box is pretty tight, quite tight in fact. You really want to be wearing driving shoes, which I am not. I'm able to do it, but it's pretty tight, and that's something you'd want to be doing if you were driving this car frequently. It's also relatively tight, the seating position in here, your knees and the steering wheel and that sort of thing, but it's not that bad. I've certainly driven 80s, 90s supercars that are worse. Now, one interesting thing that I'm finding is that it's actually a fairly easy clutch. I was expecting it to be very, very heavy, like a Ferrari Testarossa. A lot of cars like this from this era had pretty difficult clutches, but not this one. This one just kind of goes in and it actually feels pretty smooth and sweet. Same deal with the shifting. It actually feels pretty easy and pretty nice to use. The car itself actually also feels surprisingly well put together. You know, a lot of these older 90s cars, especially from orphan brands, it's hard to find parts. It's hard to keep them in nice shape. This car idles very smoothly, which is a surprise. It feels like a nice, obviously it is a nice, well-kept car, but it certainly feels like it as well. And you wouldn't really think that necessarily of an EB110, considering how difficult it is probably to find parts and keep these cars running correctly. Can't believe I'm driving an EB110. It's unbelievable. The newer Bugattis are very cool and they do very, very well in YouTube videos, and everybody's into the Chiron, Veyron. But to me, especially growing up in the 90s, I mean, this was such a mythical car. You know, you heard about XJ220 and EB110, like these were sort of the dream special cars. You never saw them, and you still don't ever see them, really. Yeah, shifting is surprisingly easy in this car. I'm actually shocked by just how easy it is to shift gears. It's really not so bad if you can fit, which is a little tight for me, but doable. But the clutch is just like fine. It's just like totally acceptably normal. The shift lever, it like drives pretty well. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. It was a very expensive car at the time, and Michael Schumacher bought one. He probably knew what he was doing. But I don't know, surprises me. Also, just surprised how smooth it is. I can't believe I'm driving this thing on the road. So this is a terrifying experience. This is one of those cars where if you damage it, you're not going to be able to replace it. You damage it, you make the news. It's very different from a modern supercar where it's just, you know, a 488, it's an expensive car, but they're around. This thing is like part of history, car history. I am really surprised at how civilized this car is. Back in the 90s, there were so many ridiculous half-hearted attempts at exotic cars. I always just kind of wondered what this one was like. But it actually feels fairly reasonable in terms of the driving experience, at least. The steering actually feels pretty good also. Obviously no power steering, but that means good steering feel in this car. And so it is pretty precise and it responds relatively quickly to inputs, which surprises me. All this intimidation about this car, I think, is largely based on the production numbers and the fact of what Bugatti became later, obviously making the craziest, fastest, most expensive cars in the world, so you're just really nervous. But ultimately, it drives like a pretty good sports car, and they probably benchmarked some pretty good 90s, 80s, late 80s, early 90s sports cars to create this car. I can't believe I'm driving this thing around, I'm coming up to like stop signs and stuff, and people don't really take notice. Like, they notice it because it's like a weird sports car, but if I saw one of these things, I would absolutely next level lose my mind if I saw some crazy guy driving an EB110 around LA. It would change my year. I really can't believe how it idles. It idles relatively normally. It doesn't feel like it's, you know, I've driven Diablos and stuff from this area. They kind of, Countachs feel like they're about to explode whenever you're at a stoplight, unless they're really well maintained, and even then. But this car seems pretty nice. Oh, it does seem to do well even as you get into higher revs. I'm not going to go crazy with it. It's a very special car, but it accelerates reasonably well, and it sounds pretty good doing it, and it feels very smooth. And I do like the steering. The heavy steering feel feels cool. The manual steering. And so that's the Bugatti EB110. This is an amazing car. I have wanted to review one pretty much ever since I started my YouTube channel 8 years ago. In fact, I've wanted to get up close to one of these my entire life, and I'm thrilled that I finally had the chance. This is truly, truly incredible. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Anyway, now it's time to give the EB110 a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the EB110 is striking and breathtaking, but it's not really beautiful. Very 90s, special, but not gorgeous, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration, Bugatti apparently claimed 0 to 60 in the low 3-second range, so it gets a 9 out of 10. Handling is sharper than I expected. You think these cars are so intimidated, but this one seemed engaging enough, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Fun factor is reasonably high given the performance level here, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and this one's obvious. This car is cooler than almost any other. The Bugatti before Bugatti. And it gets a 10 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 41 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. This car doesn't have much, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is low. The interior is surprisingly tight, and I barely fit. Add that to the usual supercar comfort issues like ride harshness and difficulty getting in and out, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Quality is only okay. A lot of the interior stuff is shared with other Italian cars from this era and kind of generic. And of course, reliability is a big question mark, so it gets a 4 out of 10. Practicality is a disaster. There's no storage, and this car is so rare and valuable, you'd be afraid to drive it anywhere, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Finally, value, and I must say, I think these are undervalued. They sell for less than $1 million, and I think, given Bugatti's reputation and this car's rarity, they simply should be more expensive. It gets an 8 out of 10 for a total daily score of 17 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 58 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars. This is actually an amazing chart to look at because I've now reviewed the majority of these 90s supercars, so you really get a good comparison of them. The McLaren F1 reigns above all, of course, but otherwise the 959 is the best on paper, but I personally would rather have an F40 or an F50. The EB110 beats out the Vector W8 and the Jaguar XJ220 though, as it should. The Bugatti is better built than the Vector and it drives better than the Jag, but all of these cars are 1990s poster icons. Boy. F40 and a EB110.
What a day.
I can't believe people don't notice it, but then again, this isn't a modern supercar, you know.